Okay, to recap. Johan and Marianne, Erland Josephson and Liv Ullmann, married. Happy marriage, 10 years, seemingly picturesque marriage. Interviewed, talked about how they stay in concord with each other, how they support each other, and everything's going swimmingly. Cut to dinner date with friends Peter and Katarina. Their marriage is on the way down, eventually culminating in a scene of mutual acrimony between the two, and seemingly Katarina saying that it's time that they get a divorce. Hey! Finally, in the last section, Marianne and Johan debate whether or not they should have a baby, and ultimately they decide, or Marianne decides to have an abortion. And the fallout of that is seemingly their relationship is doing fine, but Marianne seems a bit remorseful about her decision. Yeah, let's get into episode 2. I made it through about halfway. I made it halfway through this a couple years ago, and so from this point forward, I'll be going in blind. Oh, by the way, this is Scenes from a Marriage by Ingmar Bergman. If you didn't know that, Ingmar Bergman is a Swedish director. This was made in 1973. It stars Liv Ullmann and Erland Josephson, and it's a seminal work in Swedish cinema. Anyways, on to episode 2. Also, a reminder, as always in these longer form videos, to stay hydrated. The art of sweeping things under the rug.
God morgon. Jag hade 5:00 och sen kunde jag inte somna.
Varför kunde du inte somna om då?
Jag låg och retade upp mig.
Ska jag dåligt samvete?
Nej. För ovanligheten skulle du oskyldig min älskling.
I do like, this will eventually turn on them, I'm sure, but I do like the kind of banter that they have, the sarcastic or ironic way that they speak with each other.
Tänker du ringa återbud? Vad tror du din mamma kommer att säga då?
Hon får säga vad 17 hon vill. Jag tänker ha en fin söndag ensam tillsammans med dig och ungarna.
And I also hope that you appreciate that I have to pause, stop and start a lot more with this than with other Bergman works, because this is really dialogue intensive in a way that even his more like philosophical works aren't. There's like a lot more like pauses and interjections and like visual stuff that's being established in his other works, and this one's like squarely dialogue driven and at very fast pace.
Du skulle ju ringa återbud.
Så det tänkte jag att du skulle få göra.
Nej, tack ska du ha. Jag tänker inte trassla in den här bortförklaringen med din mamma.
I don't want to lock arms with your mother. Another confirmation that perhaps they have a more discordant relationship with their in-laws than previously established.
Du ska inte ringa din mamma idag. Hon är ju så hyggligt morgonpigg.
Kom inte överens om att det var du som skulle ringa åt.
Nej, men älskling. Ring nu. Jag ska hålla dig i handen och vara ditt moraliska stöd.
And that's another... this is another kind of establishment of their dynamic, that Johan believes his place is to provide moral support, and Marianne is the one who actually has to do things. I love the way that Liv Ullmann performs with her eyes. That's especially established in Cries and Whispers, like a shocking scene of her and her husband and that.
Jo, hör du mamma, det är en sak jag tråkigt nog måste tala med dig om. Nej, men mamma, det ska ju vara ett nöje och inte en förpliktelse. Ja, då, det går så bra så. Ja, det passar utmärkt. Ja, vi gläder oss.
Revolutionen kvävdes i sin linda.
What a terrible thing to say to a woman who just had an abortion.
Ville du att ditt liv skulle bli så här? Tänk om du och jag började bedra varandra.
I love how Marianne keeps on broaching this subject. She said this also previously in the previous episode about, like, hypothetically, if they were to cheat on each other. And also it's been established that Katarina is the one who cheats in the relationship between her and Peter. Having an idea of how this story plays out, I'm pretty sure it's Johan who steps out. And that's not a comment on him being, like, you know, morally inferior or whatever. But... weird Nordic doors.
Ja, det är trevligt att åka med det så här på morgonen. Det skulle vi göra mycket oftare.
Man, that mic does not sound good in that car.
Jag bara att få åka med det. Vet du? Ibland får jag en obetvingligt lust att bara flyta. Kanske sjunka.
Är man inte den lusten?
Du.
It's interesting how expressive Marianne is within the relationship, because she really, really doesn't offer her perspective in other settings.
Du är en jäkla
She's
pedant.
very much more self-censoring.
Säger du det?
Du hatar andlig och kroppslig oordning.
And I think that's an interesting dynamic to the relationship, if that's being elicited specifically in how she communicates with Johan. If sometimes Johan is perhaps like too accommodating or too, not disinterested, but disaffected, and so she has to volunteer her thoughts more readily.
Hej.
Hej.
Hey, Gunnel.
Hör jag?
Ja, tack.
Gunnel Lindblom, also a frequent collaborator with Bergman, but you may recognize her from as the Norse maid in the Virgin Spring.
Vad ska jag göra då?
Den här pennan.
Also been featured in another video that I have not gotten out yet for this channel, but
Jag ska försöka träffa med penspetsen. Och om du inte träffar så ska
by
du
Maj Zetterling.
Den rör ju på sig.
Nej. Det är inget skoj där. Den ser alldeles stilla, ser du.
Yeah, and I guess this idea of optical illusions, of not being able to see what's in front of you, that also kind of plays into this dialogue that we're having about marriage, about these things that are within our vision, but we can't see them because of personal bias or blind spots.
Vad arg du blev. Har du abstinensbesvär?
This is also like a conversation with the ideas of fidelity in a marriage, of abstinence or indulgence.
Jag tänkte försöka härda ut ett tag till.
Ser du? Ta en cigarett.
And you know what Johan does? He dips right into indulgence.
Det var skönt. Gud, vad gott.
You know, I'm sure there are YouTubers or analysts that'll read the psychological aspect of this and give a very Freudian interpretation of their interaction.
Jag satt hela eftermiddagen igår och läste din diktsamling. Mycket noggrant. Jag förstod ingenting.
Var det så konstigt?
This kind of black space feels so 70s.
Nej, du är den enda som har fått se dem. Jag är inte intresserad av poesi.
Yeah, that's why you showed her.
Ja, det är nog inte.
Vi var flera stycken i vår grupp som trodde det skulle bli något märkvärdigt av dig.
That's a terrible burden.
Vad det med dikterna att göra?
It's interesting, this idea of stagnation that's being posed. Johan may be cottoning on to a feeling of bustling up against this stagnation in the same way that Marianne is, and the two will probably choose different ways to address this issue.
Du blev bestämt ganska sårad.
Ja, men tackar fan för det.
Lilla Johan. Lilla Johan.
Lilja.
Vad jag har sagt.
Nu så här, första gången så försöker vi bara ställa själva problemet och sen får vi se hur vi kan lösa det.
Jag vill skiljas. Hur länge har ni
Oh, I
varit
love
gift?
this scene so much.
I över 20 år. Nej, jag har varit hemma
Beat for beat stolen by Noah Baumbach.
Varför vill fru Jacobi skiljas? Ja, min man är mycket skötsam. Han är snäll och ordentlig.
This is great, by the way. If you're an older, middle-aged woman
Han har varit en
and
utmärkt
you have
pappa.
whatever reasons that you want to leave a
Yeah,
marriage,
yeah.
you should.
Vi har en bra våning.
Not to say that you shouldn't like think about it
Ett gammalt
deeply,
sommarhus som vi har ärvt efter min mans mor.
but you shouldn't feel social stigma of leaving a
Vi
marriage
båda
after so
intresserade av
long.
musik. Låter ju bra alltihop. Ja, det gör det.
So again, the public-facing image
Men
of
det
what an
finns ingen
ideal
kärlek i
marriage is,
äktenskapet.
and what the personal, the private experience feels like.
Låt en fråga. Kommer det inte att bli ganska ensamt då?
Jo, det tror jag nog. Men jag tar hellre den ensamheten när jag fortsätter i ett äktenskap utan kärlek. Han har frågat mig 100 gånger vad det är för fel på vårt äktenskap eftersom jag vill skiljas. Och jag har talat om för honom att det är omöjligt att leva i ett förhållande utan
And I just want to speak briefly about like how
Frågar han mig vad
wonderful
kärlek skulle
it's a conventional choice, but utilized in this
Jag har
manner,
svarat honom 100
having the
gånger.
camera in between them for these
Eftersom det är omöjligt att beskriva någonting som inte finns.
for the
Hur
shot
har fru
reverse
Jacobs
shot.
förhållande till barnen gestaltat sig?
It brings you so
Men
much
jag
closer
känslan-
in their conversation,
aldrig
like you're
älskat
sitting in
mina
the middle
barn.
of it, and you really get to
Vet
take
jag
it,
nu.
take in the
Förr
entirety
trodde jag ju att jag gjorde det. Det
of
gör
this
man väl.
woman's admission.
Men numera vet jag att jag har aldrig älskat dem.
An incredibly frightening admission.
Fast jag har varit en ganska bra
Spoken
mor åt dem i alla fall. Jag har gjort så gott jag
by in a like a articulate but unemotional way
någonting för dem.
of a woman who's had to play at convention her entire life, but finds that none of it has been fulfilling.
Tänker just nu. Yes. Jag tror att ni tänker att den där fru Jacobi, hon är alltid en humorfri och bortskämd kvinna. Hon har allt vad man kan önska sig i världen. Men hon upphör inte att bråka om något diffust och fjärran som hon kallar för kärlek. Jag ska tala om en sak för advokaten.
I love this actress's eyes. I love how much Liv Ullmann deflects in the reverse
Den
shot.
stämmer inte på någon enda punkt med verkligheten.
Her eyes immediately set down.
Förlåt en fråga in.
Jo, jag inbillar mig att jag har möjligheter till kärlek. Men allt sammans ligger
Hands.
inneslutet i ett tillstängt rum. Sorgliga är att det liv jag har levat hittills har bara kapslat in mina möjligheter mer och mer.
And the transformation in Liv Ullmann's eyes when she suddenly recognizes something that she knows.
Hindrar varandra på ett dödligt sätt.
Det låter ju skrämmande.
Oh, I love this performance of negation, of a person whose entire identity has been negated by this social act of marriage.
Jag menar,
She's not upset, she's not distraught.
Börjar svika mig.
Her entire personhood has been denied.
Jag kan se det, jag kan ta på det. Men min upplevelse är torr. Smal. Förstår du
And how engaged her eyes are now. She has to look directly at this thing. And the way that her eyes behave, she's not looking at a person. She's not meeting the eyes of the other actress. She's looking at herself. Tremendous, tremendous performance. Tremendous movie. All these like resets, you just try and like stamp it down. You try and forget it. You try and reset. And it just culminates. It culminates. There's this flood that's building. And there's not a single like stone in place that's preventing it from happening. It's all of these stones, these little components of the dam crumbling.
Vet du, ibland när du är på dåligt humör så kommer du med en väldigt konstig anklagelse. Du säger att jag inte bryr mig om vårt äktenskap för att du är så ironisk.
Again, their means of communication is through sarcasm, and that's being turned against them.
Det blir väl allt som vanligt.
And this form of filming them, that Johan is being filmed like on a tripod, and Marianne is a little bit handheld, and it's a repeat of that image of the camera turning down, or maybe not handheld, but it's being operated, but it's a repeat of the same camera movement, the tilt down that captured her client's hands coming apart, and her hands reaching down to tamp down the plans that she had for the two of them away into her purse. Tamping it down, pushing it down, pushing it away.
Du är så snäll. Jag tycker väldigt mycket.
This is a reinforcement of the same dynamic when they had their talk about the baby and the abortion, that she poses something that she wants, and he kind of tacitly rejects it, or forces her to reject it on her own in order to reassert her bond with him. I thought he liked Ibsen. And again, referencing the type of work that this film is in conversation with, The Doll's House.
Söcknig, urblåst, nollställd massa som hjärntvättar sig själva från födseln. Det tar mig fan hjärtskärande.
And this is an interesting conversation because feminism being a tired subject, feminism being in its first waves in being discussed in Europe in the 1870s and the 1880s, and the second wave of feminism that occurs in the 1960s, passing through Europe. now in the 1970s, or with this character in the 1970s.
Tur att ingen hör dig.
Kvinnor är ta mig fan galna. Har inte vi kvinnor en alldeles speciell begåvning för ömhet? Jag vågar inte skratta för man är ju
It's funny to see these same like arguments being regurgitated across decades, across centuries. It's a little bit upsetting, to be honest, but the same conversation of women in a subjugating position, like controlling men from that subjugation, you know, it's the same kind of like conversation that Dostoevsky is having, that Nietzsche is having, that Andrew Tate is having.
Det är bara det att två människor som lever länge tillsammans tappar lusten lite grann.
Tappat lusten har vi väl inte. Jag kan inte hjälpa att jag inte tycker det är lika roligt som förr. Jag kan inte hjälpa det. Det finns fullkomligt naturliga förklaringar.
So this is an interesting topic in terms of boundaries, in terms of either Johan or Marianne speaking about the actual issues they have of marriage.
Det finns annat i livet än sex också.
In terms of, what am I trying to say
vad
here?
jag kan prestera så får du skaffa dig en älskarinna då. Fantasi och är lite mer upphetsad.
Like in terms of crisis management, I guess I'd say. I had a better term for it in my mind, but I'm forgetting it now. But the idea that these issues are actually always present, and that's fine, but along that spectrum, at a certain point in your relationship, it's nothing. When you first meet, these issues that you have, they're present, but they don't mean anything. At the end of your relationship, they're a crisis. They've overturned everything. And there's a question in between those two poles where you're supposed to broach the subject. Where is it kind of necessary to address these issues before they turn into something overwhelming? At what point are you obsessing over something that doesn't need attention? Or at what point are you ignoring something that is going to be a big deal? And you can see from some of these conversations that both Johan and Marianne, but I think more so Marianne, are trying to broach the subject of what their boundaries are with each other, what their explicit boundaries are with each other, and how they should discuss it or change it, redefine what their relationship is. And in this case, at least, Johan is shutting down that relationship, or shutting down that conversation.
Förstår inte varför du alltid ska bråka med mig på den här punkten.
Ja, käraste, var inte ledsen nu inte. Det var dumt av mig att börja röra de här sakerna.
Jag ska säga en sak. Man kan tala för mycket om det här.
Yeah, again, a question of when should these subjects be broached.
Det finns sån som måste leva sitt liv i halvskymning, skyddat för insyn.
But who's prying eyes? There's only two of them in this relationship.
Det blir ta mig 17 som att ligga på en spikbräda.
Ja.
Skrattar åt.
Spikbrädan.
But you could definitely see the characterization of Marianne that would frustrate a male viewer, or a viewer that's like less on her side, that she is hysterical. This is definitely a conversation to be had about Annie Hall as well, that Annie Hall is portrayed in that movie as hysterical. And there's like a wall that's built up.
Du är snäll, fast du är en idiot.
Ja, det är väl tur att jag är gift med dig då.
Okay, I'm going to rewatch this section, but I just wanted to talk briefly about Annie Hall. Okay, so there's a conversation to be had about the portrayal of these women as hysterical, and whether that's an objective portrayal or a subjective portrayal. So something that people might, like younger viewers or male viewers, might run into watching Annie Hall for the first time, is that character is portrayed as like whimsical, quirky, and eventually kind of hysterical, and it seems like her points of argument are irrational, and there are like two different lenses through which to kind of understand that disconnect, where a male viewer, but a viewer might not understand Annie Hall's position within the frame of that movie, and that's something that's true here, and that's something that is certainly true in Before Midnight, and is also kind of true in Marriage Story as well. That, for one, it's an issue of men perhaps not understanding the position of where women are arguing from. What are their neuroses? What are the dynamics in the relationship that they find frustrating or are butting up against? But also, there's a question of subjectivity and portrayal that part of, whether intentional or not, part of what makes Annie Hall harder to relate to as a character than Alvy is that it's a movie made by the guy. It's made by Woody Allen, so we're in Alvy Singer's perspective throughout the movie, and whether consciously or subconsciously, Allen is reinforcing the position of Alvy Singer and kind of deplatforming the position of Annie Hall as a object as opposed to the subject of the movie. She may be the title character, but the subject of the movie is Alvy Singer, and the object of his attention and our attention as the audience is Annie Hall. So those are the kind of two aspects that I want to think about in terms of as a male viewer, a reaction to the female side of these arguments and how they may be perceived as hysterical or how they're maybe perceived as coming from nowhere. I will agree that they're hysterical. They're emotional. These are emotional women in these movies, but I don't want to affirm the narrative that they're baseless. I want to try and trace out where these arguments are coming from, and see if the filmmakers kind of recognize that or at least represent it as well. Okay, going to go back and take another look at what they're arguing about.
Den gången trodde vi i alla fall på mänsklighetens framtid.
In a shot that will be mirrored in Julieta, the men and women posing as yin and yang on the opposite sides of the frame.
Det var inte det minst viktiga.
Fruktansvärt attraktiv.
Okay, a question of attractiveness, whether or not she's
Två
attractive.
människor som lever länge tillsammans tappar lusten lite grann.
Lusten har vi väl inte.
Okay, so this is an interesting conversation with his interactions with Ava previously, and his interactions with Marianne after her abortion, whether or not he considers her attractive, whether or not he wants to physically consummate with her at this moment.
Ja, om du inte är nöjd med vad jag kan prestera så får du skaffa dig en älskarinna då som har lite
Okay,
mer
so he's
fantasi
broaching
och
a
lite
subject
mer
of perhaps wanting to step outside of this marriage, and she's kind of affirming it.
Ja, det var just det.
She's affirming it sarcastically, but that's the vagary of their language with each other.
Det lönar sig inte. Du blir bara arg när vi talar om den här saken.
Nej, nu lyssnar jag.
Is this a moment where he should be honest, where he should say that he is curious about other people?
En ganska elementär sak egentligen att man ligger med varandra. Det var väl aldrig meningen att det skulle bli ett jättelikt allt överskott.
Jag tror att jag sitter här och ljuger.
Nej, för fan.
Well, I think you're both liars. I think you're both having issues being transparent with each other.
Lägga bort det här samtalet nu och gå och lägga oss. Det är faktiskt sent.
Det är typiskt det, va? Först sätter du igång med en jättelik utredning och sen när du har fått mig ordentligt upprörd så gäspar du och säger att du sömnar och vill gå och lägga dig.
This is interesting. I will say this is him trying to, broach a subject and establish a desire to redefine the relationship. Okay, this is an interesting aspect. This is an interesting time in which he's stating a deficit or a lack, and she's taking it defensively. She's taking it as an attack on her personally, which in my mind, I don't think he intends it that way, but also relationships are only involve two people. So when one person says that they're finding something lacking in a relationship, you kind of take it as being your fault or an accusation about you and your performance. Yeah, so this is an interesting instance of Johan wanting to redefine the relationship, wanting to recertify or communicate his needs to Marianne, and Marianne expressing anxiety and having to redefine their relationship like that. That's the problem on both people's sides, that stasis, even if it represents something that's against your interests, even if it's something that you don't want, is much more comfortable than trying to constantly redefine things or explore things and coming up with new definitions of things. This idea that everybody bristles up against, that marriage is a forever institution, that when you marry somebody, you're saying that you're under contract with them for the rest of your life. But the alternative, that you have to recertify it every 10 years or every 5 years or every single day, seems like so much work, that we suffer in silence doing things that we don't want in order to preserve that stasis. This is the thing about relationships. Everything that's good and bad in them is there from the beginning. And
Jag sover nästan redan.
In the beginning you find them charming, in the end you find them horrific. And relationships, at least in my mind, at least last as long as your ability to negotiate those good and bad aspects. And I don't really mean negotiate as in like fighting for it, always getting your way. I mean negotiate as in being transparent about what you want.
Tack för erbjudandet, men jag är faktiskt
Not being so afraid of the person that you is sleeping right next to you.
Ni har nu sett andra avsnittet av 6 scener ur ett äktenskap. Liv Ullmann, Erland Josephson och Gunnel Lindblom har skådespelat. Sven Nyqvist har fotografi. Det hela är producerat av Kinematograf på Fårö och året är 1973.
Fårö, it's pronounced Fårö. Cool. That was episode 2, a little bite-sized episode for being 42 minutes long. Yeah, I love the scene between Marianne and her client. I it's just one of the most profound characterizations of an unhappy marriage for me, because like a lot of times these depictions of failed marriages and stuff are emotional, and I understand that we connect to emotions, we connect to human beings, but the presentation of this marriage as being loveless and how that affects a person and the denial of their personhood as a result, and presented in this very static, very dry way, it allowed for so much like emotion to be wrung out of it, and so much you're resistant to it initially because you're hearing just a verbal argument. You're not hearing an emotional appeal or anything, but as you hear the words further and further, it becomes more familiar, and suddenly you recognize yourself in it. And I don't know if I had this weird feeling in the beginning of this episode when they went outside and they were driving in the car initially. I was like, I wonder what's the last Robert Bresson film that that Ingmar Bergman watched. I was trying to figure out what's the closest to this. It might be Lancelot du Lac, but I think Lancelot du Lac is 74 maybe. I'm not saying this is a direct quotation of Bresson, but the way that Bergman and Nyquist concentrated on that woman's hands in that scene, I mean, you think of Bresson, obviously, for that. You directly think of A Man Escaped looking at that scene, but also structurally the scene is, for me, kind of like spiritually connected to Bresson and the ways in which Bresson tells a story that are different from Bergman, and the ways perhaps Bergman was interpreting aspects of Bresson through his own lens. Again, I'm not directly saying that this scene was an homage to Bresson, but the filmic technique of Bresson of withholding emotional experience in characters, so that you rationally understand them, so that you logistically understand them, and eventually so that you emotionally and spiritually understand them, is something that I think is being played at in this scene. That the character is not performing emotion. She's not telling you what you're supposed to feel about what's happening. You're supposed to sit and be patient and keep watching and keep learning and understanding, and hopefully you'll see something, you'll recognize something, and you'll eventually become be able to recognize yourself in that process. And so I thought that was an interesting, I don't know if that's what's necessarily what's happening or what's being quoted, but that was my takeaway from that scene. And it's just like a just fucking beautiful scene. But the willingness of Bergman to give like ancillary characters their due, to like really focus on their stories and use it to reflect on the stories of the central characters, but create like a kaleidoscope. Again, the gem, creating different facets that kind of reinforce each other, that strengthen each other. It's it's taking the prism, the gem of marriage, and turning it into the gem of art. So what's being presented in this movie is the blackened gem of marriage, this failed institution, and we're seeing from so many different facets how it's been poisoned or polluted, how couples can't communicate with each other, how couples are trapped by institutions of society, by institutions of faith, by institutions of parentage and children and friends and alcoholism and drugs and all these different aspects. And it's being transformed. So we're seeing a rotting infrastructure. We're seeing a dam where all these things are supposed to be held together, but it's all becoming loose and it's all going to be toppled over. But by viewing it in this filmic lens, we're seeing out of it art or a movie that's becoming more strengthened, that's becoming more reinforced. We're seeing different aspects of the movie link to each other, bond to each other, and strengthen each other and reinforce each other. We're seeing the two central actors. We're seeing the filmmaker who's interpreting their story. We're seeing them interpret his words. We're seeing ancillary characters being performed by actors. We're seeing their humanity. All these things are like reflecting off each other, off of that dark gem, and becoming something that's so iridescent. It's cool. Art is cool. Cool. We're going to leave it off there. That was the second episode of Scenes from a Marriage. Senere ut at damn it. Äktenskap. Let's go on to episode 3. In the meantime, don't forget to click the like button and subscribe for more old, obscure, and art house films. And until next episode, keep watching good movies.